Appliance shopping shouldn't be overwhelming. It should be exciting. The experts at Bray & Scarf understand this, and they're ready to wow you with a Labor Day sale happening now. Not only will they answer your questions, they'll offer you deals like up to 40% off select GE appliances. Plus, free basic installation on select GE Profile and Cafe appliances. No pressure, just professionalism. At Bray & Scarf, where it doesn't cost more to get more.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Most Canadian students are now back to school. With it comes a slew of emotions, but it's not the typical jitters that we should be worried about. The issues today's youth are facing go much deeper and paint a troubling picture around bullying, mental health, and poverty. A new report suggests this is a generation at risk. I'm Melanie Ng, and in this episode of The Big Story, we take a closer look at the report's findings that is ultimately urging immediate action from policymakers. Joining me for this conversation, Sara Austin, CEO and founder of Children First Canada. Sara, thanks for joining.
Thanks so much for having me, Melanie.
Sara, before we go through the actual report, tell us a little bit about Children First Canada and your goals.
Children First Canada is a national organization that I founded a decade ago, really around this vision of making Canada the best place in the world for kids to grow up. Many believe that Canada already is a world-leading country for kids, but in fact, we have been falling far behind year after year because of our lack of protection of children's basic rights to survival and development. So we're trying to turn that around through research, advocacy, and through youth empowerment. We're marking our 10th anniversary this year. We've made some big progress in a short period of time, but still we have so far to go, as this report highlights so clearly.
Let's talk about the report. It is done annually. Your organization commissioned it. It's called the Raising Canada Report. When it comes to looking at the findings, to be quite frank, they're scary. When you read the top line, the headlines, the numbers are scary, but we're going to dig a little bit deeper today. First, before we get into the numbers, can you talk about how you gathered all of this information?
Children First Canada has been producing the annual report since 2018. We have a research team at the University of Calgary that partners with researchers at universities all across the country, and we work with subject matter experts from all different types of children's hospitals and children's organizations, really the top leaders and thinkers on these issues. But we also work with children and youth. We have a youth advisory group that is heavily involved in all stages of the research as advisors, doing hands-on research. They are also participants, and they really help to shape the recommendations so that it's not just adults talking about young people, that young people themselves are helping to define the problems, but even more importantly, helping to create the solutions that are needed to improve their lives. So it's really meant to be this comprehensive look at the state of the nation's children and to, mobilize attention, but more importantly, action to improve the lives of kids from coast to coast to coast.
When we talk about the children, what age range exactly are we looking in on?
Yeah, the Raising Canada report looks at children from birth to age 18. We look at this from the perspective of children's rights. So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child protects children up to the age of 18. And we really, take this approach that children are not an act of charity. This is not just something nice to do for children, but children have rights protected by international law. And we're trying to look at this from birth all the way through adolescence.
Sara, in combing through the report, the big headline that a lot of people will see is around bullying. So the number that I will pull, and I would love to hear a little bit more about it, more than 70% of Canadian youth between the ages of 12 and 17 experienced bullying in the last year. That's top line. There are a lot of pieces to that. So what did you find in your report? Because it is quite troubling.
It is very troubling. I'm an advocate for all 8 million kids, but I'm also a mom of a teenage boy who just started high school this week. And, I had a conversation with him about this data. What does this look like in his school and for his friends? And he kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, Mom, this is just, it just happens. It's so prevalent in their lives, whether it's happening in the classroom or in the hallways or in the playground, but even more increasingly online. And I don't just hear it from him. I hear it from kids from coast to coast to coast through the work that we do. We have programs where we work with children and youth from all different ages and different parts of the country where this is such a prevalent issue in their lives. And, in this report, beyond just seeing that, an overwhelming majority of our kids experience bullying, what was even more troubling to me to learn was that only a quarter of our kids actually felt that their teachers had done something meaningful to address it. And there was a disconnect that we saw in the data because there was a survey that showed that the majority of teachers felt that they had taken action. They felt they had addressed it, but clearly the kids didn't see it that way. And again, when I dug into it with my son, and with some other kids that I've talked to about it, their insights to this was that, that the teacher may reprimand the bully in the moment. They may, verbally reprimand them. They may get called down to the principal's office. But if the behavior continues to happen day after week, day after day, week after week, month after month, and that bully continues with their behavior, it really causes kids to lose hope and to really have a sense that the adults really care and that they take it seriously because it's allowed to continue to happen and with no repercussions.
So the report doesn't necessarily say, because as you noted, the teachers believe they are taking action. It doesn't mean they don't care. In reality, we've got some teachers handling 20, 25, 30 children, dependent on their classroom, and they believe they are doing their very best. There are pieces to the puzzle where it's the student, there's the educator, and then there's the parent at home. So or the guardian, where are you seeing some of the disconnects outside of the classroom?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you. I do not want to in any way suggest that teachers are to blame for this. I think often teachers' hands are tied. As you said, they've got ever-growing, class sizes. They've got complex needs in their classroom. I mean, we have a lot of things that are weighing on teachers' shoulders at any given moment. Sometimes they don't have the tools available to them to really address this and nip it in the bud. And I think we have to come at this from all angles. We need to have much more honest conversations with children, with students, with educators, with parents, and with policymakers, because clearly, that we've made big strides in talking about bullying, and we have Pink Shirt Day, multiple other campaigns and events that happen throughout the year around ending bullying. And kids feel much more free talking about it, which is a good thing. And, in some ways, it's a positive thing that kids actually feel more comfortable saying that they've experienced it. But if we're not ending it, and if it's allowed to perpetuate, then we're not really getting to the root cause. And, I've really done some deep thinking about this. And I think really at the root cause of this, we have a generation of kids who really are lacking a strong sense of who they are, lacking that strong sense that they are valued, that they are important. We tend to think of bullies as being the strong, aggressive ones, but often bullying is, masking a deep insecurity in a person, that they are, they're using that outward behavior to try and control or belittle others because they don't feel good about themselves. And, and I meet a lot of young people today who are really lacking that sense of belonging. They don't know that they truly matter. They don't necessarily have strong relationships with their peers or with their parents or other caregivers or trusted adults in their life. They're just feeling a bit adrift. And I think we really have to get back to the basics of how do we help our kids have that strong sense of self? How can they stand up for themselves, to stand up to, for others, and really create that sense of belonging and community that our kids so desperately need?
This is such a difficult generation. I recall growing up in the 80s, 90s, and we didn't have to deal with the digital world. We didn't have to deal with the online cyberbullying. And through your report, 2/3 of youth having experienced, the online technology, 2/3 of youth having experienced bullying, 1 in 5 experiencing cyberbullying. I'm going to guess that number is actually higher because, just in my circles alone, it's quite scary, especially when I see it in the female window. I have a lot of, I've got nieces. I've got a lot of girls who look to social media as the reality. When you talked about identity, often they see their identity online. Who do they represent? And when they see images or they see words put out there that aren't very favorable for them, it really does make an impact on who they are and how they view themselves. You talked a little bit about policymakers. Let's go backwards. People might be familiar with Bill C-63. That's the proposed Online Harms Act. And then also Bill C-412. So that's to enact the protection of minors. When we had that election, this kind of put everything on hold. So what are you proposing, especially from a report like this? How much of a priority should this be moving forward?
The need for an Online Safety Act is urgent. It really has to be at the top of Parliament's agenda as they resume this fall. it is, we, along with many others, have called for years for an Online Safety Act. It finally got tabled, as you mentioned, this spring, and we actually had two bills, dueling bills, if you will, from the Liberals and the Conservative Party on this. I really want to see all members of Parliament coming together. This is a nonpartisan issue. This is an issue when we all, we need every member of Parliament and every senator on the same page. Our kids are, increasingly at risk from a very, very young age. The kids are on their tablets from basically when they're toddlers all the way through their adolescence. And, we're seeing, very jarring headlines these days about roadblocks, about the harms from Meta, from Snapchat. We could go on and on about the ways that our kids are exposed to really grave harms on any given day, and the way, from what, as you were talking about, from shaping their mental health, to their self-image, to the, explicit content that they're exposed to on, platforms like Roblox. It's just the Wild West out there, and so much pressure is being put on kids and on parents to try and regulate this. That is absolute nonsense. Canada is so far behind other wealthy democratic countries when it comes to the regulation of the technology and technology companies and online spaces. And we have a long way to go. And so I really hope that with Parliament resuming this fall, this will be at the top of the agenda. We're hearing a lot of talk these days about nation building, about, built investments in infrastructure. I really think that we need to talk about children as nation building. They are a quarter of our population. They are 100% of our future, and they deserve our time and attention. And they deserve to have legislation that protects their very basic rights to survive and thrive.
Sara, are there countries, in your opinion, that are doing it right now?
When we look at, how Canada compares to other countries, right now we're ranked 19th out of 30 OECD or wealthy countries, according to UNICEF. And even sadder than that, we are ranked 67th on the Global Kids' Rights Index. And so we, have to bust this myth that Canada is a world-leading country. We are far, far behind. It's not surprisingly, you see the Nordic countries out as leaders in many regards. They really put children at the heart of their society, on the top of their legislative agenda. They're so much further ahead in many ways. But even on things like online safety, you can just look south of the border. They've taken steps in this regard. It's not perfect by any means in the US, but there are countries. Canada's not leading in this regard, and we don't have to recreate the wheel. There are lots of examples, and as you said, there were already two bills that were tabled on this spring. One of the real challenges in this is that the digital environment is evolving so rapidly. Even since those two bills were tabled this spring, we've seen a lot of changes, particularly around how AI is exposing kids to really, really grave risks around, the distortion of images and the online harms that are created around that. The AI chatbots have been this huge issue that's emerged over the summertime. And so it's really hard for legislation to keep pace and sort of anticipate all of these things, but we need to start. There have been a lot of experts who've come to the table, a lot of children and youth that we've worked with who've come and met with policymakers who were demanding this. And sadly, too many parents who've lost their children. We continue to highlight this in our research and in our advocacy. It shouldn't come to a crisis where kids are dying by suicide because of sextortion or, online bullying. We've lost too many kids. One child is too many, and we have lost dozens of them because of these horrific cases. And so I really, really urge our parliamentarians to take this and treat it with the urgency that it really deserves.
Sara, something else that the report has highlighted, which is really eye-opening, is around childhood poverty levels. Can you break down some of the findings here?
Yeah, for me as a parent, this was one of the most heartbreaking parts of this year's report. Child poverty rates have increased to 13.4%. That's over 1.4 million kids growing up in poverty. And that's the biggest increase we've seen since 2017. During the height of the pandemic, we had made some modest progress. There were increased investments through the child benefit tax and additional benefits that were being invested in families during, the height of the pandemic, more income supports for families. But with a lot of those supports being withdrawn or reduced, we've seen this backward slide into poverty again, and more kids falling through the cracks. And what that really means for kids, we hear these statistics, but these are actual kids, who know what it's like to go to school without a breakfast in their tummy, without a lunch packed in their backpack, who are just struggling to get through the day. I can't function if I don't have my breakfast. I don't know what it's like for a kid to sit in a classroom, being, not adequately nourished, trying to pay attention in school, these kids are not going to be thriving academically. They're much more likely to be misbehaving and be reprimanded in their classroom. And at the end of the day, they're not likely to be going to, to a hockey, practice, or to a dance lesson, or to a music lesson. These kids are often going home to an empty apartment because their parents are working long shifts to be able to keep a roof over their head and put food on the table. They're more likely to be experiencing domestic violence because their parents are under such enormous stress that is just bleeding out into this really toxic environment. That impacts kids in not just in the moment, but it's impacting the way their brain is being wired. It impacts the way their body is developing. There are physical repercussions and mental repercussions that will be felt for years to come. There is not only a moral, economic imperative to tackle this, there's a clear business case for it. We know that when kids are healthy and well, they have better lifelong outcomes. They are less likely to be a burden to our healthcare system, less likely to be ending up in the justice system or, needing social services. It's crass that we have to talk about it this way, but what is it going to take to get people to do something about it and not just think that our food banks or, and lunch programs are going to solve this problem? Of course, they're doing meaningful, important work and they're filling a much needed gap, but we need to really think about this as like the business case for tackling these issues and really getting business leaders, policymakers to the table to find some urgent solutions for our kids.
I want to highlight some other findings because, of course, those are the big ones that were, as you say, quite troubling here. But other things, childhood mistreatment, racism, climate change, big things that have shown up in this report. What are the conversations around these topics?
Yeah, these are topics that, obviously the data paints a pretty stark picture, but, there are also things that kids themselves are talking about, whether it's through programs we run like the Young Canadians Parliament or a program we have in classrooms called Being, Belonging, Becoming. These are issues that kids are dealing with in their lives day in and day out. Child abuse is a really tough topic to talk about, and yet, the data shows that it's, really become it's at epidemic levels. 1 in 3 Canadians experiences some type of child abuse before their 15th birthday. Let's just let that settle in. A third of our population dealing with child abuse before their 15th birthday. That it really is such a shocking and galling statistic, but I've seen it firsthand in the lives of so many kids. I used to run the Child Advocacy Center here in Calgary, where we would deal with the worst of the worst child abuse cases. And it's really traumatic for a kid to experience something like that. There's so much shame and stigma associated with the topic of child abuse. A lot of Canadians simply don't want to talk about it, but it's clearly a crisis that's hidden in plain sight. It has public health implications that we really need to come to terms with. And I think, there's a lot of talk these days about consent. We've seen the Hockey Canada scandal and so many other things hit the headlines, but we really need to be talking about these issues from a very young age, obviously in an age-appropriate way, but with kids from an early age around their bodies, about bodily safety, about consent, and not just having this one and done kind of conversation, but continuing to talk with our kids as they navigate through their early years, as they go into adolescence and as they grow up, so that they are better equipped to be able to address these harms and prevent it. But also to that if it happens, they know how to get help so that they don't just feel afraid to tell anybody, but they know that they can reach out to a parent, to a teacher, to a coach, a member of their faith community. They know who are the helpers who will be there to help them find a way through this.
There is extensive information in this report, and as you say, it's done annually. So let me ask you this: have any policymakers, any government officials come to your organization and said, yes, let's take this and let's implement that? Have they ever come to you?
Yeah, I'm pleased to say that the Raising Canada report has played a big role in some very major changes that the government has made in recent years. And one of the things that we had long called for in previous reports was the need for a national school food program. We've continued to highlight food insecurity as being a really grave risk to children. And we were so excited to be a part of, a big announcement with the federal government last year when they announced the National School Food Program, an investment of $1 billion, and to be now over the past several months, all provinces and territories have now signed on to that. That means this is really going to be a national program in every province and territory. That was something that we had a really big hand in, along with many other stakeholders. And children and youth, had a direct hand in helping shape that policy and that program, and are now helping to roll it out in their schools. That's one tangible sign that we've been able to make progress on. Another big victory we've seen is the creation of a new youth mental health fund by the federal government, an investment of $500 million. That's something that we really championed along with children's hospitals and children's charities who work in the mental health space. That's, again, a huge victory. I guess what I would emphasize is that these are big wins, but, the rubber hits the road. Kids are back in the school right now. Are those lunch programs being delivered in the school? Is that mental health funding being, flowing to the organizations who can deliver the effective solutions? But at the end of the day, we really need to be getting at the root causes. Why are so many kids living below the poverty line? Why are so many of them experiencing violence? We could just look at what's causing these problems, get upstream. We've called for the creation of a national strategy for children and youth. This is one example that we've been talking about this, honestly, for over 20 years about the need for a strategy. Canada's last strategy for kids was written in 2004. I had a hand in helping to write it. We shouldn't be having to push for 20 years for such a basic thing. I'm pleased to say that Senator Moody has tabled legislation for that in the spring and plans to retable it this fall with Parliament getting back into session. But again, this needs to rise to the top of the pile. We can't afford to have this, sort of falling to this, to the bottom of the heap amongst many other competing priorities. We need to really think about kids as being not just one of many stakeholders, but really as the heartbeat of our nation, and to treat them as the urgent priority that they really deserve to be.
They are our future. Sara Austin, CEO and founder of Children First Canada, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Appreciate it.
And that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all of your favorite podcast players. Make sure to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Melanie Ng. Appreciate you listening.